This is our fireside chat, sans fire. It seems a tad warm for a fire today. Nonetheless, we will have the chat. I'm really excited about this conversation with John Inazu. For folks who don't know John, he's the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the founder of the Carver Project and the Legal Vocation Fellowship. He is a senior fellow at Interfaith America and the Trinity Forum. He holds a BSE and JD from Duke University, and quite strangely, a PhD in political science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Duke and Chapel Hill don't usually go together, but I think it's kind of prescient of the conversation we're about to have. How do you talk across divides?
If we can do it there.
Exactly. It's quite a big one. He's the author of several books, but today we are going to talk about his latest and greatest, Learning to Disagree, the surprising path to navigating differences with empathy and respect. So thank you so much. Great to have you here. Before we jump in, I did want to note, John has been sharing this, so I don't think it would be overstepping. It seems he was bitten by a bat recently.
Well,
yeah.
Allegedly, maybe.
Maybe, allegedly. And so it does not seem that he has rabies. But just in case, don't let him bite you.
That's right, that's right.
All right, so be careful.
Well, so this is funny because I was in a room, I woke up to a bat in my bedroom, and they're presently testing the bat. And I called yesterday after I landed in Minneapolis, and the office had closed early. And I thought, this is not the office that should close early, right? If I need to know if there's rabies or not. So anyway, still waiting, but.
One of the things that I do with books is, so I like books with pretty covers. And this is a very pretty one. And so I look for covers first. The second thing I do is I always read the acknowledgments or the foreword. And the foreword that was written by Tish Harrison Warren, I read, and I thought, this is going to be the best book ever. And he is an extraordinary human. There are certain things that she says as she describes this effort and in describing John. So she acknowledges the cliche, America is beset by polarization. I don't think anybody's surprised by that. But she also went on to say that we need a better way to live together amid irreconcilable views of God, truth, morality, and justice. She goes on to describe John as a field guide for the practice of civic virtue in our everyday lives. Now that has to be on your tombstone. Let's just plan it now. Talk about a eulogy virtue. She says, these pages are a field guide to the joyful, hopeful, and necessary task of learning to disagree in a way that, in the end, teaches us to flourish, which I just think is an extraordinary effort and endeavor. It's important to note that this book is really in contrast to lots and lots of books that are out recently about the challenge of polarization, about deliberative dialogue, about civic dialogue, about talking across difference, because it's told in the first person by a human being who's really trying to be a good person. And he's open about his frustrations. He's open about his love for coffee shops and the donuts. And you see a person really grappling with what it means to disagree well, to engage others that have different points of view. And as I read this, I remember this very odd semester I had at Duke when I directed the Keenan Institute for Ethics. And two of my favorite colleagues were co-teaching a course called Adversarial Ethics. The two individuals were an analytic philosopher and a lawyer. And they loved one another. But this class was a war zone because neither of them could understand that a classroom wasn't a battlefield, that being right wasn't not the end all and be all. They had to, in each conversation, one up the other. And it was this bizarre, bizarre dynamic. And as I'm reading this book, I'm thinking to myself, sort of these two lovely people are having the most absurd battles over what was really low stakes scholarly conversation. And I thought, where was John Inazu, right? Why wasn't he part of this conversation to help diffuse? Because I was totally lost in how to navigate that. So with that, let's just jump in. John, so for folks who haven't read the book, but intend to buy it and have it signed by John, for your own birthday gifts to yourself or to others, can you just give us a little sense of why? Where did this come from? What was the inspiration? What were you trying to achieve?
Yeah, first, thanks. I mean, that was an amazing setup. You should be my publicist if you need another job. And thanks for having me here. And I should also say, Aaron and I went to college together, so this is a fun reunion in that front, and love being at Notre Dame. So why the book? This came to me at the height of the pandemic, when, at least in my part of the world, we were very socially distanced and isolated, and I was just watching all the outrage build online, everybody just with different views about COVID and policies and everything else, and the shouting and just the lack of any kind of grace or nuance around that, and thinking there has to be a better way to move forward the pandemic certainly reminded a lot of us that we were made to be with other people, but being with other people requires a set of skills and abilities to dialogue across these differences that we're stuck with and that aren't going away. And so it occurred to me two things about my life that might be helpful and maybe instructional in trying to figure this out. One is the classes that I teach. I'm a law professor. I also teach undergraduates, but this book is mostly focused on the law part. I teach criminal law and law and religion. Those are classes that raise a lot of high stakes issues and ideas that we disagree about. And I teach these students who are widely divergent in their beliefs, and we figure it out and make it work and try to train them to be good lawyers. And so I thought there were stories and approaches from the classroom that could be useful, not just for law students, but also for you and me at the holiday gathering of family or the neighborhood picnic or these ordinary interactions. And then the second part of my life was all of the times that I tried to take those ideas and put them into practice in my own ordinary relationships and then just massively screw them up. So if I could put together a story that is sort of the classroom greatest hits alongside all of my failures as a person and make it in a narrative form, maybe there'd be something useful for people to engage with.
And I do think for people reading this, the kind of honesty and integrity with which you've approached this is just great. The other thing I really appreciated was the structure. So you have this set of chapters earlier on. The first one's on empathy, fairness, then you talk about compromise and the inability to compromise. Maybe you could pick one of those chapters and tell us a little bit what you were trying to do in that particular one to kind of get us rolling.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the empathy one, which is chapter one, and in some ways frames the whole book. And I start that chapter with a discussion of how I try to teach empathy to my law students. And I start on day one when I'm teaching criminal law with a case about cannibalism. And it's a pretty striking case if you've never encountered it before. It's from the 19th century. And it does raise these very dire situations. I mean, the spoiler alert is most of criminal law is bad people doing horrific things to other human beings, and it's a hard semester to get through. But I teach the case on day one because it illustrates some nice concepts about punishment and the purposes of punishment and rehabilitation and all these things, but also to try to get my students to think about the limits of empathy. So I think good legal training is training in empathy. You have to understand the other side as well as possible. You have to put yourself in someone else's shoes. You have to make the best version of another argument so that you can tell a decision maker, not they're stupid and evil, but this is a really hard idea. They've got a pretty good argument and I have a better one. And that's how you persuade and convince people in discourse. And so I'm trying to teach this and instill this in my students. And then we get to the cannibalism case, and part of the reason for that case is to say, and there are limits. Sometimes you're just not going to be able to put yourself fully in the other person's shoes. So we're quick in the first minutes of conversation, we're quick to condemn the people who killed and ate the guy on their boat. And then we step back and say, okay, well, what would it be like to be starving on the high seas, days and days with no food, and you're going crazy and the sun's blaring down and there's no hope of rescue? I've never been remotely close to a situation like that. So for me, as I'm like sipping my Starbucks, to be able to say that's awful and terrible, we can still make moral judgments and we can still say bad things happen in the world without going all the way and saying, I know exactly what I would have done, the right thing in that situation. And to say that there's actually going to be a limit to our empathy and our understanding, and not just that circumstance, but lots of others. And so we try as hard as we can to understand as fully as we can with a kind of humility about how far we can go.
And in teaching that, do you feel that it's something that students internalize and actually take away with them? Or do you feel, like many of us, that student gets it in the context of a class and then they leave and they're in another setting and somehow it disappeared?
Yeah, I think in the best case, over the course of 13 weeks, we can start to get there with repetition, and particularly repetition within the same group of people. So as they start to learn about each other, and one of the real gifts of teaching at a place like Washington University is we've got a very diverse set of students. They come from all over the world with very different ideological beliefs and backgrounds and experiences. And when you jump into a class like criminal law, and people in that class have had very different experiences with law enforcement up until that point, and maybe they've never met someone else with a different view. And you do case after case and story after story where they're having to grapple with this person who's my friend, who I've listened to for weeks and is very smart, has such a wildly different view from the get-go of this issue that I need at least to think about it and think why I'm approaching it so differently. And so in the best case, over time that happens, but it takes trust, it takes time, really hard to shortcut that into one conversation.
Great. What about the notion of fairness? Right, you talk about this very diverse group that you're working with who probably are coming to the table with very different notions about what is right, just, and fair.
Yeah, I think one of the real gifts of law for us as a society is it shows us why ultimate fairness is just utterly elusive in this world. Nobody is against fairness. Nobody is against justice. We all long for these things, and we encounter in the world harms and injustices that we want to see righted. And then once we think about it for a while, we realize, one, it never really happens, and two, it's very hard to get even remotely equitable. So think about a judge who has to sentence someone in a case. What's the right sentence? What's the right form of punishment? Well, it starts to depend on lots of different factors. And even if you get close there, then you have the next case. And then you have to figure out, well, how is this one equitable to that one? And what's fair in this situation? And we could have unending debates about fairness. And really, the best the law can do is bring a kind of proximate fairness or proximate justice to ruptures in the social fabric. And we need that. So the premise is super important. It's much better to have a law-governed society where we try for that than the alternative where it's just street violence. But we shouldn't pretend that proximate fairness or proximate justice gets us what we want. We're left with this massive remainder of harm and injustice in the world, of imperfect attempts at fairness with human decision makers who are going to get it wrong. And that's just part of the condition of being a human being, especially in a diverse democracy where we're going to be shaped by very different experiences and see things quite differently. And a lot of, I think, our arguments today in culture are not even on the same level of trying to get to the right logical understanding. It's starting from such wildly different premises about what fairness is or what justice is, and realizing there's not going to be a conversation to get us lockstep about that starting point.
So as I was reading that chapter, I was thinking about the notion of fairness in the law. And at the Center for Social Concerns, we have a mass incarceration research lab. And one of the questions is always the criminalization of poverty. And I recall about 2 years ago, my whole gaggle of kids and my husband were driving from Washington, D.C. through rural Virginia, for reasons nobody could understand except my husband, who thought it would be shorter. It was like a 9-hour drive. And it was bizarre. And everybody was cranky and hungry and had to go to the bathroom. And so we're driving, and we quickly transition into North Carolina. And the speed limit goes from like 75 to 40. And he's not paying attention. He's just trying to stop the screaming and yelling. And he gets a ticket. And it's, sort of one of those fairly menacing, like you're going to lose your license, there you could be imprisoned, there's like a $5,000 fine. And, he's someone who drives like a grandma usually and has never even had a parking ticket, so he's freaked out. And where, instantly he gets a ticket, and then suddenly there are all these lawyers like, we can help you out. And he finds somebody who's like, yeah, don't worry about it. I can get the fine down to $100. You'll do like 10 hours of community service, and this is all going to go away. So we go to court to kind of do the plea bargain with the court, and there were about 400 people there. He was the one person with a lawyer. And you saw person after person after person lose their license. Some get custodial sentences. Like, it was bananas. We thought, right, we paid this guy $60, and this went away. And you realize that, right, there's some people for whom that's not possible. There's so many things, right? I totally agree. We live in a society where law is critical and certainly better than the absence of it, but the inequality of it still exists. Mm-hmm. How do you navigate notions of justice and fairness with the inequality of it? And how do students that you engage with encounter that, coming from such radically different cultural, religious, socioeconomic backgrounds?
I mean, one of the norms I sometimes have to push against is some people come in thinking those are the people who break the law and we are the law-abiding citizens. Well, the fact of the regulatory state, I mean, I'm sure we all right now are breaking a dozen federal regulations being assembled in this room, right? Some of them with potential criminal offenses. So we're all lawbreakers. There is no one innocent among you. And then we can get into sort of conversations about speeding and so forth. And then what your story I think really powerfully illustrates is how quickly and massively the inequities can occur. So with a position of power or stewarding the resources of the law, one thing to do quite practically is to work for greater clarity, more equity in these sorts of situations. And I think this actually ties back to the empathy point. If we can put ourselves in the shoes of someone who might not have the same instinct or ability to call the lawyer and pay $60 and then forget about it. And so one of the stories I tell in the book, not unrelated to the one you just gave, is my own encounter with the law where I allegedly turned right on red. And I had to go to traffic court. I only figured out I had to go to traffic court because the ticket itself was terribly confusing. And I called a lawyer and said, I don't understand this. And after some shaming, she said, well, you are a lawyer too, so maybe you can just go represent yourself. So I walk into traffic court, and this was just 2 years ago. I've litigated in courtrooms. I've trained prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges. I know all about courts, and I was utterly terrified walking into traffic courts because I'd never been in that building. I'd never done that metal detector. I had no idea where to go or where to sit or who was in control. And I'm walking and I've got a little file folder. I'm the only one in the room with a file folder, but and also hundreds of people in chairs waiting for what their version of justice is going to be. And I think and then as I start talking to the lawyer, I'm stuttering and I'm very and I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe you're my former student, but I still can't even handle myself in this moment because of this power dynamic. And I think feeling in a visceral and real way when you are on potentially the losing end of power, especially if you operate in your life, much like I do, where you are seldom on the losing end of power, just to get an ounce of that empathy and realize this is for a lot of people, this is daily existence in very ordinary and mundane circumstances like going to the grocery store or driving out of the neighborhood. And the disruptions, instead of your $60 fine or my appearance in traffic court, could be upending their lives or the people they love. And I think I think first just awareness, knowing this is happening all around the country, empathy for it, and then trying to figure out how do you work to address it.
Great. Later on in the book, you talk about a really important pivot. And you say, can we just pivot to seeing people instead of problems? And you start with one of my all-time favorite C.S. Lewis quotes, "There are no ordinary people." Can you talk about that distinction between people and problems and why that's so critical?
Yeah, this became a chapter in the book that was just kind of cataloging or confessing all of my personal failures time after time in this area. Because I'm a lawyer, I'm very type A, I go through my day efficiency driven, and it's very easy for people to become problems in my life, to become interruptions in my day, someone who's going to slow down what I'm trying to accomplish. And one of the things that I kind of discovered, or at least reinforced with myself writing this chapter, was you can't, if the aim is better disagreement or empathy, that step one is just seeing the person. If you can't do that, good luck doing the rest of it. So slow down and see the person. And so I sort of share some painful stories. One I'll tell here. A couple people here know my wife, so this is even worse to share publicly, but I guess I wrote about it. There was a time I was practicing law in North Carolina and billing hourly, and we were very strapped for cash. We just had our second kid. We had this mortgage. I was only working hourly. We had to pay all the bills. And so the more time I billed, the more money we made, the more we were able to make ends meet. And my wife Caroline and I got in an argument one Saturday morning, and these arguments that just are going to take a long time to resolve. So this one, it took 3 or 4 hours of kind of walking around the house and avoiding each other, and finally making amends and reconciling. And then I looked at her 4 hours later and I said, "Do you know how much money this argument just cost us?" So there's a very clear example of my failure to see a person rather than a problem. My spouse, in fact. I tell this story to my law students and they just think I'm making it up. Like, no way you can be that stupid. But I really was. And that, you might imagine that there were even fewer billable hours later that day as we continued.
I think that's great. Last night, David Brooks shared some marriage advice, so probably came a little too late for you in that one.
Could have used a lot more.
You have a chapter on faith. Can you talk about that chapter?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's this is not I'm a Christian. I've written some explicitly Christian books. This is not a Christian book. It's not written from a faith perspective, but I do have a chapter, the title of which is Can Anyone Trust Faith? And part of the point is a leveling move, just to remind everybody that whether you're religious or not, you're operating on all kinds of faith assumptions in the world. Some of those are theological and metaphysical. Some of them, many of you flew here on an airplane, and the degrees of faith that it took you to get on that plane, from the pilot to the engineer, especially these days, right? Whether that bolt is tightened or not, we're making leaps of faith all day, every day. We're relying on proximate authorities, and we're trusting secondary affirmation of authorities that we know nothing about ourselves. And that's just how we get by with life. And we don't really have any other choice but to try. And so we do the best we can moving forward in our faith commitments, some of which are expressly known, others of which are unknown. And so what I'm trying to do there is to say, this might actually be a point of common connection if we can understand each other as necessarily constrained. Maybe you might see it as freeing, but you might also say it's constraining. It's constraining to live in a world where I have to rely on faith of different kinds, but it's the fact of the world that we're stuck in. So you could also see it as an opportunity for connection. And then the pivot I make there is also to say, and be careful about what other aspects of the world vie for your faith-based allegiances, because we can also encounter the world in somewhat unconscious ways with faith claims. And so toward the end of that chapter, I talk about the connection between faith and patriotism, and particularly in this country where there's such a tight connection between patriotism and faith for so many people. And this is I'm trying to work this out in writing this chapter as I'm wrestling with this in my own life. I'm someone who comes from a military family. My dad was career Army. I myself was in the Air Force. I'm an Air Force veteran. And there's part of me that is deeply patriotic and likes some of the patriotism sorts of things, like Lee Greenwood and all that is fine. But there's also part of me that sees a real concern with those direct pulls on faith and allegiance that sometimes go unnoticed by people around me in some of my circles. So one of the practices that I've adopted as an adult is I don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I don't put my hand over my heart during the national anthem. I will stand reverently and at attention, and as a veteran, I think it's super important to honor the sacrifice and commitment of people in our services. But I don't want to signal in my words or my actions something more than I actually believe. And so, for example, when you take the oath of office for any federal or professional position, you swear to uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And it occurred to me a few years ago, what happens if my faith became an enemy, foreign or domestic, of the Constitution, which seems quite plausible given the history of our Constitution. Imperfect, evolving, getting better, but still never really there. And so I thought, I don't know, I don't really want to be pledging allegiance to this thing, swearing my allegiance against all enemies. I want it to be a conditional loyalty, and maybe I can take this small step toward that end, just as a reminder that in this complicated world of faith claims, I want to be sure what my own are. And it sometimes gets me in hot water. I mean, sometimes when I share this story, people don't like it, and I get that because patriotism is deeply held by a lot of people. I spoke to the veterans of foreign wars and was, not pledging allegiance in the front of the room before my talk, and that was also a little awkward. But I don't go. I mean, I'm not irreverent about it, but it's just an example of where I think because we are all depending on faith all the time, and because these claims are actually so deep and so core to who we are, I want to be careful about the relative statements that I'm making.
So I know this is, not a book that's written from your Christian perspective, but you are doing a variety of things more in an interfaith space. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of conversation across religious faith traditions, not faith in Mike Seelinger's airplane?
Yeah, I think actually interfaith conversations have gotten a lot easier. Now there's a caveat that I think the faith to non-faith conversations have gotten harder, but interfaith, and the one reason it's easier is because people are being more real about them. So in the 1990s, interfaith was sort of a soupy multiculturalism, right? I remember this as a college student where you got all the campus groups together and we held hands and we did a blessing of the animals or something weird that was everyone could agree on. And when you actually started talking to people, nobody actually believed this was not my faith, and we have these differences. And now I think the more contemporary interfaith efforts are those that say, let's start by taking seriously the stakes of our differences, why they matter, why for many people they have the utmost consequences. And that's actually going to limit to some degree our intimacy with one another. So my good friend Ibu Patel, who's the founder of Interfaith America, and we've collaborated on lots of different projects over the years, and he's a Muslim and I'm a Christian, and that leads to lots of differences. And we sometimes talk about those differences and name them with specificity. And as a result of those differences, there are things that we do not and cannot do together. We don't pray together. There are other things, and yet we still have a very deep friendship around all of the common ground that we have, and in some ways a deeper friendship than I have with many people of my own faith tradition. And it allows us to, by highlighting the common ground and our common interests, allows us to be very real with each other, but also to collaborate. And Ibu, he came to me a few years ago and he said, as a Muslim, I have growing concern for how Christians in this country are behaving, so I would like to help Christians be more Christian. Can you do that with me? And so he threw a bunch of money at a couple projects, and we've been working in two areas specifically. One is what we're calling evangelical and evangelical adjacent leaders, and then the other is with Christian faculty on non-Christian campuses, and just saying, in these two groups of people, let's help equip them to be deeply and authentically Christian in what they're saying, and also graciously interfaith. Or one way we frame this is, how do you live faithfully and neighborly in a world that you don't control. If you start with the premise that you don't control the place, a lot of good things can happen. If you're trying to run the show, it's a different game plan and it can be a lot harder. So I think, but all of this to me starts with, or the possibility of that partnership starts with the authenticity and the naming of our very real differences and then being okay with them. Now the caveat that I mentioned at the beginning of that comment is I think that the faith to interfaith challenges are becoming more acute. And part of that is that interfaith cooperation and coalition building has always depended on some sort of appeal to the transcendent or what happens beyond this life. And for now, a growing number of people in this country who would explicitly reject, and I don't mean sort of the spiritually curious or the vague categories, but the people who say, there is no God, this is it, this is all we have, fight now. It becomes a very different set of resources and possibilities, even for discourse. Now, that's not to say these people are moral and these people aren't, because we could easily point to counterexamples in both demographics, but as a matter of discourse and coalition building and idea and theme generating, it's very difficult to speak to the people who say, this is all we have, and then speak to the people who say, there's more to this life that is not seen, and then figure out what cooperation looks like.
Great, thank you. One of the chapters I really appreciated was the one on good and evil, and in part because I've been struggling to finish a book for way too long on the false dichotomy between good and evil. And it builds on Hannah Arendt's work, but also this sort of chance encounter I had at an informal refugee camp of Syrians in Jordan, where I encountered a human like no other I had before that simultaneously embodied my sense of what good was and my sense of what evil was in one human, and sort of trying to work that through. Could you talk a little bit about this? I think folks will recall that David Brooks talked a little bit about how we think about good and evil, but I thought the way you did was just super thoughtful and eloquent.
Well, I mean, one of the points I'm trying to make very pragmatically in that chapter is when you shift from thinking that someone is wrong to thinking that they're evil, a lot of things happen in just pragmatic possibilities for discourse. If you think someone's wrong, you're thinking, well, I need to persuade you, or I need to give you a counter argument, or I need to hang in there with you. If you really think someone is evil, it's usually, how do I minimize your influence? How do I get away from you? How do I shut you down? And there is real evil in the world, so you can't give up naming the category of evil, but in today's discourse, we've seen this very rapid shift from the category of people who used to be just wrong to now the category of people who are evil, and that destroys real possibilities here. And so you can think of, well, are there counterexamples? Sure. Is the neo-Nazi just wrong, or is that person holding evil views? And you can name those evil categories, but the more people you throw in there, the harder it's going to be to figure out a common political project to move forward. And I think another pragmatic point is you just sort of run out of ammo at some point, right? If you're going around the world saying you're evil, you're evil, you're evil, then what happens when like the neo-Nazis do show up at your door? You're evil too? Or is there anything left to name that with descriptive accuracy? So I think trying to move back to a more gracious understanding of when people can be wrong, and that wrong can also be deeply immoral, deeply harmful to the country, something that you absolutely want to work to minimize or win against, and you can still relate to other people. And I think we do this all the time in our ordinary lives. I think of my colleagues at work. If we sat down and cataloged our beliefs, we would each mutually think each other holds beliefs that are just abhorrent, right? That are dangerous to society, that are diminishing human flourishing, that are bad for the world, and yet we still teach together and get a drink and live our lives. And we do this, we shop with these people, right? We live lives with people who hold very harmful ideas, and on balance, we see them as complex human beings. We don't see them as dominated by evil. And then often we get online and just think, that's evil, you're evil.
Mm-hmm. One of the most beautiful chapters is the one on forgiveness and the story that you tell of your grandmother. Could you tell that?
So my grandparents were interned as Japanese Americans in the Second World War. My dad was born in the camps. And so I've known this for forever, and I've written about this before. But as I was thinking about this idea in the context of this book, I happened to go visit Manzanar internment camp in California. I was at a conference in Los Angeles, and I'd never been there before. So this is as I was writing the book and thinking, am I going to tell the story or not? And it was just, it's very hard to describe how profound that experience was. So first of all, if you don't know where this is, Manzanar, quite deliberately, is in the middle of the California desert. It's a 4-hour drive from LA. You can't get to it by accident. And you get there, and it's just sand and nothing in this open desert area. And when I rolled up there on a Sunday afternoon, it's run by the National Park Service. So I mentioned to the ranger that my family had been in prison there, and he was very gracious, and he was able to pinpoint or direct me to the exact location where their little place had been. And so I walked over to, the block, and they didn't call it a cell, but it was a cell number. And it was 500 square feet, 7 family members in these 500 square feet. And just standing there and watching, thinking, what would life have been like? And I remember my grandmother had talked about just the indignity of the shared bathrooms the whole time as she'd been 29 and my grandpa was 35 when they were sent to the camps, and their whole lives were destroyed. And then they had these, when the military shut down the camps at the end of the war, they basically just took the tents away and left. And so there's still all this stuff all over the ground. And so I found these pieces of the shards of pottery that were probably from the bowls where my grandmother had fed my dad as a kid. And it was unbelievable to see this kind of in real life and 3D. And it just brought it all much more powerfully close to home. Before the war, my grandfather had a degree from Berkeley and was supervising an engineering company in Santa Monica. And they lost everything. He died right after the war, and my grandmother raised my dad and 4 siblings in total poverty. And then my dad, he died a few years ago and had a very tortured life. And I always thought, the camps, he was just a 2. When he left the camps, how bad would that have been? But really, he was 2, and so for 2 years of his life, he wasn't held as a baby. He was in the midst of this chaos. So this all was just the magnitude of what had happened there hit home in a very new way. And then I remembered my grandmother, before she died, had written just very eloquently, I forgive this country. This cost me dearly, and I think about it every day, and yet I also love this country, and I love the opportunities it's given me and our family, and I choose to forgive. And I thought, if she can do that, and then, and I recount, there are other very national famous stories of powerful examples of forgiveness. If they can do that, if my grandmother can do this, then surely we can all work on forgiveness in more ordinary and mundane circumstances. And it might be, maybe, if you encounter something on that magnitude, forgiveness is hard and not everyone can do it. But in the ordinary social day-to-day where we're going to screw up and we're going to say things the wrong way and we're going to offend people, if we can't do the little acts of forgiveness, given the inspirational models that we've seen elsewhere, then I think we have a lot of work to do.
One of the very last chapters is, can we be friends? And I think we've talked a lot about the importance of friendship here, the importance of relationships. And as I read it, I was reflecting on my own friend group. And my friends tend to have views wildly different than mine. So I like people who do something totally different interests, because I find it fascinating. But I also realized that when I have close friends who have divergent political views or divergent ideologies, we do the Irish thing and we just pretend it doesn't exist, right? We talk about everything but that. Can you talk about this notion of friendship? And I'm thinking maybe I should have those conversations. And then I think, would that destroy the friendship? And could I do that effectively? So can you talk about that particular way of thinking about friendship?
Yeah, I think, this was actually this was the last chapter, and it was very fun to write, but also very hard to write because I had all of these sort of adjacent thoughts about friendship and was trying to figure out how to make them cohere in some way. Part of what I tried to convey was that real friendship has to be a mix of the ordinary and the hard. So I have some academic friends where all we do is get together and talk ideas, and they're friends of a sort, but sometimes I think, like, we got to just be able also to have a beer or go on a walk or, just talk about sports or something other than philosophy. And then there are other friends who are just on the superficial level, and I think it'd be nice if we could ever get to that hard conversation or that hard difference. And part of the case I'm trying to make in this chapter is maybe the best kinds of friendships are the ones that mix both together, and all of those ordinary and mundane circumstances provide an architecture to then have the occasional hard conversations and to go deeper. You can't do it all the time, and you can't do it without the base architecture. It's going to be a disaster. And I've got other failure stories about the disasters I've had when I've failed to either establish the architecture or mistakenly thought that I had it. But I think there's something to that work in the normal. And then I guess another thing that comes to mind, I didn't actually include this in the book, but I was talking to Greg earlier today. It reminded me of Stanley Hauerwas, who was one of my mentors in grad school. And I think real friendship ultimately is necessarily tied to a kind of appropriate vulnerability, but that vulnerability then necessarily sheds a kind of distance. And so I was thinking about Stan with this because I remember as a young grad student, I just thought everything he wrote was absolutely brilliant. And then after a while, he shared me a rough draft of something he was writing, and it was, I guess we are recording, but it was terrible. And I just thought, like, how could Stanley Hauerwas have written something so bad? And then I realized, and actually I had some expertise that could make it better. And so in this process of working with him, that was the moment I think that he and I became friends and not just mentor and student. And it was a moment of his real deliberate vulnerability with me, and it was a moment where I lost some of kind of the distance and the sense of, I think I maybe saw a truer version of him than would have been possible. And I say all this to say that in friendship and in life, I don't think you can have one without the other. I think as we move toward authenticity and get to those hard conversations, it also means we lose a little something of the polish or the sensibility we have or the image or the caricature we have, good or bad, about the other people in our lives.
Great. You wrote the book sort of during the COVID period, out now. Probably more polarized society than when you started the book, if that's possible. What's John Inazu's broad wisdom for us today?
I don't. That's way too much of a setup. No. Well, but let me pivot a little bit and talk about this conference and the people in this room, and try to tie it back to the first panel this morning, because I do think if we are not the people who can figure out how to model this well, with all of the privileges and institutional resources and practices and knowledge collectively, then I don't know where else we're going to see this. And part of the real pain of what's been happening in higher ed, especially since October 7th, is just how many models of failure and vacuity we've seen. I mean, the big sort of dance I've seen with a lot of both personal experience at different campuses, but also reading it in the news, are these administrator types who are suddenly talking about our community values and what we care about. Well, if the moment of crisis is the first time you're raising that, it's way too late, and nobody believes you anyway. And so to think about what would it mean to build credibility and a real sense of community around which we could then have these deep disagreements and model them well with the resources that we have in higher ed, and to train. I like what Steve said about, you've got to play a much longer game, and you're not gonna, no one's gonna change anyone's views about who to vote for in November. It's baked in. So don't have the frustrating conversation with Uncle Fred think about like, what do the next 10 years of my relationship with this human being look like? Or in what institutional context can I creatively think about how to help people be formed differently into better conversations? And I think this is actually quite possible. I mean, I sometimes get accused of being a pessimist, but I think higher ed writ large is sort of a doomed enterprise. But
you're not pessimistic at all.
But within that, like as we watch its collapse over time, there are lots of opportunities, and I think there are opportunities for individual institutions and sub-institutions and teachers to do, I think, really amazing things. And I think we need more of that and more empowering and examples of that. And I think leadership matters tremendously. I mean, the way that I've seen some of these situations diffused and also communities intact versus the alternative, leadership and buy-in has made a huge difference along the way. So you asked me something about wisdom, which I don't really have much of in the current moment, but I do think in terms of a charge or an aspiration, like this group of people and the networks and institutions you and we represent, I mean, this is where the work has to happen. And I'll tell you one sort of quick story to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. The last undergraduate class I taught was a political philosophy seminar about a year ago. And it was, by design, fairly small seminar, maybe a dozen students. And in week 11, I said, I'd never done this before, but I said, okay, I'm going to change it up. And instead of the readings for the last 2 weeks, you all have to come to class and give us all 500 words on an issue that you care deeply about, that you would be scared to death to talk about publicly at Washington University. And then I said, and after that, I'm going to grill you for 15 minutes in front of the class with all the possible counter arguments I can come up with on the spot. And you could see, you could feel the collective dread of this class.
And half them dropped the class.
Week 11, they're too late. And then all of them came through, and it was amazing. And the issues, I was shocked at some of the views they had, both left and right. And they were unpolished because they hadn't been able to talk about them with a lot of people, and the counter objections and discussion was raw but really good, and it was in a trusted environment. And afterward, some of them came up and they just said, this was the greatest thing. This is why I came to college, and I'm a junior, and this is the first time I've had this experience. And so they were talking about it after the course ended, and one of them said, Professor, you should do this class again next year, except instead of waiting until week 11, the whole class should be this. And this is to your point. I said, if I had trotted this out on week 1 and said, here's what we're doing, every single one of you would have dropped. The only way this was possible is that we spent 11 weeks doing Rawls and other political philosophy stuff. And in the course of the 11 weeks, we got to know each other a little bit, and it was small enough to do this. And you trusted me enough to take the risk with me. And it worked, and you can do this, and the rest of us can do this. We're not all going to be able to take part in 13-week seminars, but we can find friends and say, let's commit to meet together 4 times in person or 6 times. And rather than just have sort of as you think about with your friends, right, the hard conversation you don't want to have, one way it's likely not to go well is if you say, Friday night, we're talking about immigration, and then we're moving on, right? Because it gives you a forced deadline that ratchets up all the stress because you're not going to be able to convince people or even maybe help them understand your views of things in a 2-hour conversation. But if you say, we're going to do, we trust each other to commit to six meetings together, and we're going to give ourselves space to leave and go away and think and maybe do some other reading and come back with better questions and more trust the next time, then maybe you make a little bit of progress. And you don't, most of the studies suggest you're not going to end up changing someone else's view over these really hard issues, but this is the verb in the title of the book. You're learning to disagree in a way that you can continue to do that and hopefully scale it in other parts of life.
Great, that's wonderful. So I want to open it up for questions. John? Dean Sue?
Oh, can I just say, before you ask this question, so I was a Duke undergrad.
I know.
She remembers you.
But I'm very grateful for you and for your
That's very
influence on
kind, thank you. And I won't reveal your disciplinary record. So in light of your comment about higher education being doomed, and in light of the fact that I just ate a lot of sugar, I can't help but think about your comments initially about the criminal justice system and sort of the unfairness that goes along with it. And some people are represented, some people aren't. Some people enter the system knowing what to expect, others don't. I can't help but think about higher ed and our student disciplinary systems. And we're seeing that sort of roll out since October with demonstrations and protests and encampments and the police getting involved or just the student conduct systems. And we have students who are similarly situated in that process. They don't know what to expect. They think there's a huge power dynamic. Many people are able to hire legal representation. And at the end of the day, many of them are just not willing to accept accountability for their behavior, partially at least because they don't trust the system. Do we have a role in all of that? What can we do? Do you agree that that's an issue first? And is that part of the problem that we have in terms of the level of trust that people have in what we do and who we are? But many people just see us as a bunch, not necessarily the folks in this room because so many are faculty, but as a bunch of bureaucrats who the power's gone to our head, and we are doing, we're holding students accountable unfairly and not recognizing that they just don't have necessarily the information, the power, the wherewithal to really deal with the process that's being handed to them.
Yeah, it's a huge question and a great set of issues, and I won't be able to comprehensively answer it. I do think it ties back to one of our earlier discussion threads about notions of fairness and even what's fair, and from your particular vantage point, what's fair and especially equity across cases is very hard to mete out. And so I don't want to pretend to generalize or advise what any particular institution should or shouldn't do. I do think there's been, at least in the cases and the institutions that I've seen, there's been a lack of, I would say, genuine grace. There's been kind of performative release of certain cases, right? Or pressure-filled releases. But what about just sort of like grace in certain, I mean, it would be nice to see that, or even a graciousness about how to handle some of these complex situations. I do think, I mean, this administrative piece is, I mean, there are a lot of administrators in the room, I have to be careful here. But it is this weird kind of echo chamber experience where you start, I mean, I'll take a safe, for example, to illustrate the point, but I think the analogy will hold. We are, a university with which I'm familiar recently went through a strategic plan, and so the top level bureaucrats, spent like months and months with the consultants and everyone else working through the strategic plan. None of the rest of the university knew or cared about it. And then they roll it out like this. I mean, they were like super emotional. This is amazing. And then we're wondering, like, why is no one on board? Well, you're in the echo chamber figuring out what the strategy is and what the plan is. And you didn't bring anyone else in your community along. And then you're struck wondering, why is no one with me? So in these situations too, I think there are a lot of backroom meetings, often in crisis mode, and then people trying to figure out what is going on here and where's the community piece of this. But I think I'm going to actually use your question to go back to like the higher ed is doomed point, because I really do think this in most situations, and part of it is tied to the panel, but it's still like, look, it's great opportunities. It's tied to this, just the malaise of institutional purpose at most of these places, where you couldn't name the purpose of most of these institutions. There are exceptions. I think this one here is an exception. But even the exceptions are very tricky and fraught these days. I mean, so the other thing, this will tie a little bit to the character discussion this morning. Growing up as a kid, I lived on both the U.S. Military Academy and the Air Force Academy. And then when I was practicing law, I spent a year investigating the Air Force Academy. So I've got some good familiarity with the service academies. those are places with a purpose, right? You can talk. They're not worried about the purpose question, but even there, so purpose and honor becomes fixated on the honor code. Don't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. And then when sexual assault hits the academy, they don't even have anything in their resources to figure out what to do with that, because it's not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate. And the kind of narrowness of mission and purpose, even in that situation, that cuts against sort of character formation and community care. And that's an example of a place that actually has a purpose. So now try doing that at Duke, or some other institution that's completely fungible with Duke. And again, I'm an alum. Go Devils! I love Duke, but it's pretty purposeless. And so I think to be able to be actors within those institutions and say, oh, I can help name a sub-purpose, or I can be part of a community, or build an institution that's going to help even within maybe what a fundamentally broken structure is. We can do things that can form people differently, and we can demonstrate grace, and we can, even if we're not the people with all the power, we can affect the people with some of the power.
John, I really appreciate that response. This is the last thing I will say, and I love the grace thing. Somehow we have not been able to reconcile accountability with compassion. Mm-hmm. And it's a win or it's a lose. We've got to hold you accountable. You've got to agree. We've got the upper hand. We've got the process. And if you don't, too bad. You can fight us. And I think if we had a mindset of grace and compassion, we would end up at a very different place and may actually have a better learning outcome.
Well, and this is interesting too, because so my scholarly focus and what I do with most of my day job is about the right of assembly and protest. So I do a lot of work with protesters, advising, the whole spectrum. I've got some great stories, everyone from Occupy Wall Street to anti-abortion protests and everyone in between. But the student protest movement is often, even the well-intended kind of super passionate ones don't have a strategy for long-term coalition building, which is going to depend upon some fusion of grace and accountability and all of these things. And then the rest of us are not doing a super great job of modeling what that might look like. So instead of saying, just to have a more strategic, longer-term view of what protest is, what civil disobedience is, who should be involved and to what end, and to be then disciplined about it and to help model for students what that might look like. I'm all for a good protest, although when I've been protested, I'm less on board with that. But we are not, even those of us in higher ed who are around the protest culture are not doing a very good job of modeling what that might look like in a more imaginative, creative, transformative way.
Great. Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Pavlik. I'm an emergency medicine physician at Medical College of Wisconsin and a medical educator. I have two questions for you. The first one was, how many days ago were you bit by that bat?
Yeah, right. I know why you're asking that question. I'm not sure I was bit. That's the thing. There's some ambiguity. And we don't know if it's, I know. Well, this is, now since you asked that, I've got another quick story to tell. When I was working at the Pentagon, it was during the anthrax attacks in DC, and I had a package that I was handling. It was a litigation package, but somebody, did the anthrax thing and thought, maybe this is anthrax. And it was like the same week that other offices had gotten anthrax. So they brought in the bomb crew and everyone and had to go test it. And my hands had been all over the package, right? And so then I was driving down to Durham to see my girlfriend, now wife, and I remember just driving down 95 thinking hope we're all clear, because if not, it's way too late. So I'm kind of thinking the same with the bat, right? Let's hope it's not rabid, because otherwise your question is very valid.
Well, my second question is unrelated to the first.
Yeah, how do you follow that one?
Right. So my second question is, you were talking before about evil, and my mind went off when you were talking about that, because one of the things that I've found in talking, and I've had conversations with people at this conference about this, is that I think when you say some things are evil, probably a lot of people in the room go, mm-hmm. And if you would talk to my students about that, I don't know that they would be on board with that. And the example that some people and I have talked about is cheating. That students are fairly explicit now that they don't think that cheating is wrong. And so when you're having conversations and dialogue, we aren't even starting from the same assumptions that some behaviors are just wrong. So how do we go forward with that?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I do want to disentangle wrong and evil. So I would say I wouldn't use the word evil to describe cheating. I mean, I think it's a bad in the world, but I really want to try to help reduce the frequency of the use of the word evil and save it descriptively for narrower categories. But you're right to point out lots of disagreement about what wrong is. Now, going back to the evil point, I think actually, and this is where I think more of us just need to risk conversations, because the challenge, and this is pretty naturally human. You get into a heated discussion about an issue and someone says, you're evil, or an analog to this is you are denying my humanity, right? And it feels like a conversation stopper, like, well, I don't want to be the person denying someone's humanity. But then if you actually follow up and press a little more into the specific question, if we're talking about, and in the book I talk about some of these hard cases, most complex policy and legal and moral questions are not, the stakes are not you're evil or you're denying my humanity. It's usually more nuanced than that, and you can have a conversation about why you have different views. But you have to be able to jump past the initial conversation stopper and the direct attack to say, let's press into that a little more. And then what do you do, to your question, when there's actually just fundamental disagreement about the stakes? Well, here, on a society level, that's a very hard question to answer. It's one of the reasons we've got big problems in the country today, because we don't actually have any agreed upon purpose of the nature of the country, what it means to be a human being, what counts as human flourishing. And we'll have like these very deep base level disagreements over those huge matters. Within an institution, especially an institution with any kind of clarity or purpose, you can start to name what the assumed or agreed upon values and principles should be. So within an academic institution, here's what cheating is, here's why we, if you're going to be part of this community, agree to these sets of norms. And then you can sort of build in a collective buy-in around it. Now, having said that, I just read on the plane here Sal Khan's new book about AI and higher ed. It's a fascinating book. It's called Brave New Words, I think. And he's actually making me rethink even my own categories for what cheating are when you bring in some of higher ed and what counts as cheating or not. Like, what's the difference between an AI-generated first text and Grammarly? And so anyway, I think the lines are good. For a lot of us who worry about this with writing and assessing writing, these lines, we're going to have to ask ourselves some of these hard questions, and the lines are going to get maybe more blurred. But at the end of that discussion, at the institutional level, we can still decide as a particular community or set of leaders, here's what we mean by cheating, here's what it means to be part of this community, and here's why you don't do it. And then there's actually some agreement over what otherwise might be a contested term.
Eric?
John, twice you've said higher ed is a doomed enterprise. Say more. Yep, you said twice that higher ed is a doomed enterprise. I'd love for you to say more. Somebody this morning said they're not investing in higher ed, right? Sell, not buy. So it's resonant for other things that have been said here.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have said that in this room. I mean, I think it's just, to me, fundamentally tied to this purpose question. I mean, I think our most powerful, wealthy, and elite institutions in higher ed not only have no idea what their purpose is, but they're incapable of recovering it. And we could bring in, I mean, how much time do we have? We could bring in where the money's coming from, the pressure of NIH and other kinds of government grants, the donors, big-time sports, the different constituencies and demographics, we were talking about the student sort of customer focus, and why AI is going to be another part of this too. And we're having massive inequities grow as well. So I think, I mean, I'm probably overstating it a bit to say the whole thing is doomed, but I think a lot of places, by doomed I mean some places are going to be, like, actually go out of existence because they're going to be on the losing end of this. But a lot of the biggest places are going to be around for a long time. They're just never going to have a lot of coherence to them. And there's still, I think, real capacity to do things within them. But I would say the way I think of the question is, how do I pursue faithfulness and human flourishing within a fundamentally broken set of institutions. Not how do I fix the institutions, but how do I pursue that within them. And I actually think there's a very similar question to be asked of law right now in other institutions. And at the end of the day, I'd rather have the institutions than not have them, but I'm not in the kind of idealistic let's fix them, because I'm just not sure they're fixable.
Maybe one more. Or we could.
We could wrap up 4 minutes early. Wow. Well, thank
But
you.
we ended on I think higher ed is doomed.
Oh, okay. All right. So, okay, Elise has a upbeat question. Thank you, Elise.
Okay, thank you. So maybe to end on a more positive note, I don't know,
Please,
depending on
please.
your response.
It's up to you.
I've done some work with Simon Greer and one of the other senior fellows at Interfaith America with his Bridging the Gap program. And so I'm just, in thinking about that mindset, kind of you being connected with their work and writing about this work, implementing it in your classroom, what are programs that you think, or people who are implementing this work, that we can kind of look to and seek out that not only have maybe good pedagogy that can be kind of replicated in other classroom settings, but maybe also have some evidence behind them about changes that they see amongst their students?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, Interfaith America is not a bad place to start, because they have the programs, they've done a lot of the work, and they increasingly have data to back up some of their findings. So I would start by looking around their website and their organization. And I do think I do think this is, before jumping to evidence, I like the question, especially in a room like this, but before jumping to evidence, I would maybe revert to what kind of people are we forming and what kind of people are we looking for in this shared enterprise. I was just with Ibu last week, and we had this long debate about what counts as sort of a pluralist mindset. And he was trying, I don't think with someone who's looking for a kind of ability to live, coexist, learn to disagree, you're not looking necessarily for any of particular political persuasion, but you're looking for a temperament that says, I'm willing to be in this conversation with these people. And you can actually get people who are very far left and very far right who are committed to that enterprise. And then people who are, and I think an analog to this is I sometimes get called a centrist or a moderate, and I really dislike that label, because I don't think I'm centrist or moderate about any of my substantive positions. I think I have very strongly held views about lots of things, but I do have kind of a temperament that says, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this, or I can learn from you, and I'm not a relativist, throw it up in the air, but I want to listen and engage. And I think there's a kind of temperament around that we can find people across the political, religious, ideological spectrum who are, if not committed to that, can at least be inspired by that. And I would start there and building coalitions there. And that feels very optimistic and happy to me. So.
It does. Well, thank you for ending on an upbeat note. Still a minute early, so thank you. This has just been a wonderful conversation.